Did you ever wonder if everything you learned about women in the past was completely true? Do you think women in the early medieval times, from roughly 500 C to 1000 C, were just silent figures in the background? What if the stories you heard were only part of a much bigger, more complex reality? Number 11. Women's voices are completely absent from the historical record. When many people think about the early medieval period, they picture a time where only men created history. It is a common idea that women left no trace, no written word, no voice in the chronicles that survive. This perspective often suggests that because the history books were largely penned by monks or male scholars, the experiences and thoughts of women were simply lost to the centuries. The argument often put forward is that women were not educated enough to write, or if they were, their writings were considered unimportant and therefore not preserved. The idea is that we know very little about what women truly thought or felt because they were effectively silenced by the historical process itself. Some believe that the sheer lack of female-authored texts from this era means that we can only guess at their lives, seeing them through the lens of male writers, who might not have understood or valued their perspectives. This thought often leads to the conclusion that women of the early Middle Ages were voiceless, their lives and contributions swallowed by time, leaving behind only scattered fragments. However, if you peer a little closer, you start to find cracks in that idea. While it is true that finding direct, personal writings from women is less common than from men, it does not mean their voices are entirely gone. Sometimes you find them speaking through works they commissioned or inspired. Take, for example, the Liber Manualis, written by Duoda in the 9th century. This was a moral and instructional handbook for her son William, written while she was separated from him. This text offers a direct, personal insight into a mother's anxieties, her deep Christian faith, and her understanding of education and duty. Here, Duoda's voice, full of maternal love and theological reflection, rings out clearly from a period often described as silent for women. Her work, found in a manuscript copied centuries later, stands as a testament to her literacy and her commitment to guiding her child's moral and spiritual development. It shows a woman not just thinking, but actively shaping knowledge for the next generation. Beyond direct authorship, women's voices and actions are preserved in other forms. Look at the vast number of charters and legal documents from the time. These are not always glamorous, but they are incredibly revealing. Women appear frequently in these records, either as grantors or recipients of land, as witnesses to transactions, or as parties in legal disputes. For instance, in the charters from the Abbey of St. Gall, numerous women are named as landowners, as sellers of property, or as donors to the church. Their signatures, or marks made in their stead, appear on these documents. These aren't just names on a page, they represent women making decisions, exercising agency over their wealth, and engaging with the legal and economic systems of their time. The language in these charters might be formal and legalistic, but the very presence of women in such numbers speaks volumes about their involvement in public and economic life. Their participation was recorded, and their decisions mattered enough to be formally documented for posterity. Even in chronicles written by men, the actions and words of powerful women sometimes pierce through. Historians like Gregory of Tours, writing in the 6th century, dedicated significant portions of his history of the Franks to the deeds of queens like Brunhild and Fredegund. While Gregory often portrayed these queens through a moral lens, describing their political machinations and rivalries, he nevertheless recorded their fierce determination, their strategic thinking, and their profound impact on the political landscape of Francia. Brunhild, for instance, is depicted as a formidable ruler who governed for decades, negotiating treaties, issuing laws, and even leading armies. Gregory recorded her dialogues, her commands, and her interventions, however biased his overall portrayal might be. These accounts, though filtered, still convey the immense power and influence these women wielded, showing they were far from passive bystanders in the grand narratives of their era. Their decisions resonated through kingdoms, and the chroniclers found it necessary to record their presence and their actions, even if critically. Further evidence of women's voices can be found in hagiographies, the lives of saints. Many of these texts tell the stories of female saints, abbesses, and holy women. While these narratives were often written by male clergy to promote religious ideals, they frequently include direct quotes attributed to the women, descriptions of their spiritual insights, and accounts of their leadership. The life of Saint Radegund, for example, describes her decision to leave her royal marriage and establish a convent, detailing her conversations with Frankish kings and bishops, her devotion to learning, and her spiritual authority. These narratives, while serving a religious purpose, highlight the intellectual and spiritual agency of women. They show women speaking with authority, inspiring devotion, and shaping the religious landscape through their convictions and charisma. The stories of these women were told and retold, becoming a part of the collective memory of the age, proving that their spiritual achievements and wisdom were recognized and celebrated. Their archaeological discoveries also give voice to women, albeit in a different silent language. Grave goods from Merovingian cemeteries, for instance, often include objects that speak to the deceased woman's status, wealth, and sometimes even her personal interests. The presence of elaborate jewelry, textile tools, or even writing implements in women's graves suggests not just their material possessions, but their roles in society. The intricate brooches and beads found in female burials point to their importance within aristocratic networks, while spindle whorls and weaving combs indicate their involvement in textile production, a vital economic activity. These objects, placed with women for their journey into the afterlife, silently convey their earthly contributions and the esteem in which they were held. They provide a tangible connection to the lives of women who did not leave written records, allowing us to infer their daily activities, their skills, and their place in their communities. These material voices, though not spoken, are very much present. Even the letters exchanged between prominent figures sometimes reveal women's direct communication. Although fewer letters from women survive compared to men, those that do offer precious glimpses. Abbesses, in particular, often corresponded with kings, bishops, and other powerful individuals, discussing administrative matters, theological questions, or seeking patronage. These letters demonstrate their literacy, their administrative capabilities, and their engagement with political and religious affairs. A letter from an abbess requesting a royal grant or defending her convent's rights is a direct expression of her authority and her ability to navigate complex social hierarchies. These communications, though often formal, reveal women acting as influential figures, articulate, and capable of advocating for their communities. So, while the volume of direct female-authored texts might not match that of male authors, the idea that women were entirely voiceless in the early Middle Ages is a simplification. Their presence is felt in legal documents, their actions recorded in chronicles, their spiritual journeys detailed in hagiographies, their material lives represented by archaeological finds, and their words sometimes preserved in letters. These various forms of evidence, when pieced together, paint a picture of women who, despite facing societal constraints, found ways to exert influence, express themselves, and leave an undeniable mark on the historical record. Their voices might often be indirect, or filtered through the interpretations of others, but they are far from absent. To truly understand the early medieval period, one must listen for these diverse echoes and acknowledge the many ways women communicated their lives and legacies. Number 10. All women's experiences were uniform and terrible. The common idea about women in the early Middle Ages is that their lives were universally bleak, restrictive, and essentially the same for every woman, regardless of her circumstances. This view suggests that women were all oppressed, confined to domestic roles, and subjected to the same harsh realities, experiencing a single, undifferentiated life of suffering and limitation. It paints a picture of a monolithic female experience, where social class, geographical location, or individual choices made little difference to their daily lives or overall prospects. This narrative often focuses on the perceived hardships common to the period, such as high mortality rates, limited educational opportunities, and patriarchal social structures, implying that these challenges affected all women equally and without variation. The argument is that the pervasive patriarchal norms of the time created a uniform reality for women, making their individual stories indistinguishable. However, this idea misses the incredible diversity of women's lives during this period. The early Middle Ages was not a single, unchanging block of time, nor was it a homogeneous society. A vast gulf separated the life of a powerful queen from that of a peasant woman, or a wealthy abbess from a slave. Their daily routines, their access to resources, their social standing, and their opportunities for influence were dramatically different. To lump them all together under one label of universal oppression simply ignores the vibrant tapestry of individual female experiences. Consider the life of a queen, like Theodolinda, Queen of the Lombards, in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. She was a Bavarian princess who married King Athari, and then, after his death, was instrumental in choosing his successor, Agilulf, whom she also married. She was not just a royal wife, she was a political force. Theodolinda corresponded with Pope Gregory the Great, playing a significant role in the conversion of the Lombards from Arianism to Nicene Christianity. She founded churches and monasteries, acted as a patron of the arts, and her influence extended deeply into the religious and political affairs of her kingdom. Her life was one of power, negotiation, and significant public action, far removed from the confines of a simple household. She had access to education, political counsel, and the ability to shape the future of a kingdom, a reality that stands in stark contrast to popular generalized views of women's lives. Her royal status afforded her a level of agency and public visibility unimaginable for most. Now, contrast Theolinda's life with that of a peasant woman working in the fields of an Anglo-Saxon village. Her days would have been dominated by physical labor planting, harvesting, tending livestock, grinding grain, and weaving cloth. Her life revolved around the rhythms of the agricultural year, the needs of her family, and the demands of her lord. Her political influence was likely negligible, and her access to formal education non-existent. Her survival depended on her ability to contribute to the household economy through demanding physical work. While she might have found joy in her family and community, her daily struggles were undoubtedly challenging and fundamentally different from those of a queen. She had practical skills, deep knowledge of the land, and her labor was essential for the survival of her family and community. Her contributions, though rarely recorded in grand histories, were vital. Then there was the experience of women in religious life. An abbess, such as Hild of Whitby in 7th century Anglo-Saxon England, oversaw a double monastery, meaning it housed both monks and nuns. She was a highly educated and influential figure, consulted by kings and bishops. The Synod of Whitby, a crucial church council that decided the future direction of Christianity in England, was held at her monastery. Hild fostered learning within her community, producing scholars and future bishops. Her life was one of spiritual authority, intellectual pursuit, and administrative responsibility. She managed vast estates, directed spiritual life, and educated prominent figures. Her agency derived from her religious devotion and her position within the powerful monastic institution. She lived a life of purpose and authority, demonstrating a profound impact on the religious and intellectual landscape of her time, a life that bore little resemblance to either a queen's or a peasant's. Even within social classes, there were variations. A wealthy noblewoman, while still subject to some patriarchal norms, might have managed large estates, directed numerous servants, and negotiated family alliances. She might have overseen complex domestic industries from brewing to textile production, effectively running a substantial economic enterprise. Her role was not merely decorative, it was managerial and economically vital. Her influence within her household and within her broader kin network could be considerable, allowing her a degree of agency and authority distinct from a poorer woman, or even a different type of wealthy woman who chose a monastic path. Her concerns might have included the dowries of her daughters, the inheritance of her sons, and the political alliances forged through marriage, showcasing a life rich in responsibility and influence. Geographical location also played a part. A woman in Visigothic Spain, governed by a different set of laws and customs, would have had a distinct experience from a woman in Carolingian Francia or Anglo-Saxon England. For instance, Visigothic law codes, while still patriarchal, contained specific provisions regarding women's property rights and protections against certain abuses that differed from those in other regions. The nuances of local laws, customs, and religious practices meant that women's lives were shaped by their immediate environments in unique ways. The daily life of a woman living in a bustling trading town would differ from that of a woman in a remote agricultural village, just as the opportunities available to a woman in a royal court would not be found by a woman living in a humble rural dwelling. Therefore, reducing the experience of all women in the early Middle Ages to a single, terrible narrative oversimplifies a complex reality. The lives of women vary dramatically based on their social status, their religious choices, their regional context, and their individual circumstances. From powerful queens and learned abbesses to hard-working peasant women and enslaved individuals, each life offered a unique perspective on the period. Acknowledging this diversity is crucial for truly understanding the multifaceted roles and experiences of women in early medieval society, moving beyond a single, limiting portrayal to appreciate the rich variety of their existences. Number 9. Women had no control over their bodies or sexuality. A prevailing idea often suggests that women in the early Middle Ages had absolutely no say in matters concerning their own bodies or their sexuality. This perspective often implies that women were viewed purely as passive vessels for reproduction or as property to be exchanged in marriage alliances, with their own desires or choices being completely irrelevant. It is commonly believed that women had no legal protection against sexual violence, that marriage was always forced upon them, and that their personal autonomy over their physical selves was essentially non-existent. This narrative often paints a picture of women entirely at the mercy of male relatives or societal norms, lacking any form of agency regarding intimate aspects of their lives. It suggests a complete absence of legal recourse or social recognition for women's bodily integrity, making them vulnerable and without any form of control. However, a closer look at early medieval law codes and social practices reveals a more nuanced picture. While it is certainly true that patriarchal norms were deeply entrenched and women faced significant vulnerabilities, it is not accurate to say they had zero control or protection. The legal systems of the time, imperfect as they were, did address issues of sexual violence, and social practices sometimes offered women alternatives or forms of agency. Consider the issue of sexual assault. While modern concepts of consent are different, early medieval law codes across various Germanic kingdoms did classify rape as a serious crime, not just against the woman, but against her family or her husband, and sometimes even directly against the woman's person. The Lex Salica, a fundamental law code of the Franks, detailed specific penalties for rape, often involving substantial fines paid to the victim or her family. These fines were intended to compensate for the harm and dishonor caused. The Lex Ripuaria, another Frankish law, also outlines penalties for sexual assault. In Anglo-Saxon law codes, for instance, King Alfred the Great's laws included provisions against sexual offenses, imposing heavy fines or even physical punishment on offenders. While the focus of these laws might have been on property rights or the purity of lineage, the fact remains that a legal framework existed to address such transgressions, and it recognized that such acts were a serious affront. A woman, or her family on her behalf, could pursue legal action against an assailant, indicating a form of legal recognition of her bodily integrity. Regarding marriage, while arranged marriages were common, especially among the aristocracy for strategic alliances, the idea that women were always dragged to the altar against their will is not entirely accurate. There are instances where women, particularly those of higher status, exercised a degree of choice or influence. For example, some historical accounts, though limited, suggest that a woman's refusal could sometimes block a marriage, particularly if she had powerful family backing or if she chose a religious life instead. The monastic option offered a powerful alternative to marriage. For women who wished to avoid marriage or childbearing, entering a convent provided a socially acceptable and even highly respected path. This choice allowed women to pursue spiritual and intellectual development, often gaining significant autonomy and authority within the monastic community that they would not have had in secular marriage. Saint Radegund, for instance, a Frankish queen, famously left her husband King Llafar I to found a monastery, demonstrating a profound act of personal agency and choice over her own life and body, preferring a life of celibacy and spiritual devotion to a forced marriage. Moreover, the concept of bride price, or dowry, in many societies, while sometimes seen as a property transaction, also involved complex negotiations where the woman's family had a vested interest in her well-being and her future status. The marriage contract often outlined reciprocal duties and protections for the wife, including provisions for her maintenance in widowhood. While the ultimate decision might rest with the male head of the family, a family would often consider the woman's preferences or character in choosing a match, especially if she was seen as contributing to the family's honor or wealth. There are even records of women petitioning ecclesiastical courts over marital disputes, seeking annulments or legal separation, which, while rare, indicates that they could appeal to authorities to address issues within their marriages. The perception of female sexuality itself was not entirely monolithic. While virginity before marriage and fidelity within marriage were highly valued for women, particularly for noble women whose purity ensured legitimate heirs, there were also societal acknowledgments of female desire, even if often condemned outside of marriage. Early medieval medical texts and folklore, for instance, sometimes discussed female physiological experiences. The very existence of penitentials, handbooks for confessors, which listed various sexual sins, indicates an awareness of a range of sexual behaviors and desires, not just male ones. The focus on controlling female sexuality paradoxically also acknowledged its presence and potential force. While the early Middle Ages was certainly a time of significant patriarchal control, and women's agency over their bodies and sexuality was often constrained, it was not entirely absent. Legal protections, albeit imperfect, existed against sexual violence. The option of monastic life provided a powerful alternative to secular marriage, granting women a degree of autonomy and spiritual authority. Even within marriage, women were not always entirely passive, with family negotiations and limited legal recourse sometimes offering avenues for influence. To claim women had absolutely no control over their bodies or sexuality simplifies a complex reality and overlooks the various ways women navigated and sometimes asserted their agency within the societal norms of their time. Number 8. Women were only valued for childbearing. There is a widespread idea that the sole purpose and value of women in the early Middle Ages rested entirely on their ability to bear children, particularly sons, to ensure family lineage and perpetuate the male line. This perspective suggests that if a woman was infertile, or only bore daughters, she was considered worthless, a failure in the eyes of her family and society. It paints a picture where a woman's entire identity and worth were reduced to her reproductive capacity, and her contributions outside of this biological function were completely disregarded. The argument often put forward is that in a time of high mortality and continuous warfare, the need for heirs was paramount, thus reducing women to mere tools for procreation. This idea implies that intellectual capacity, administrative skills, piety, or any other personal attribute were considered secondary or irrelevant compared to the ability to produce offspring. However, while childbearing was undeniably important in early medieval society, especially within aristocratic families, it was far from the only thing women were valued for. Women held diverse roles and contributed in numerous ways to their families, communities, and religious institutions, often being highly valued for skills and qualities beyond their reproductive capabilities. Their economic contributions, managerial prowess, spiritual devotion, social connections, and even intellectual pursuits were often highly prized. Take the example of a wealthy noblewoman who managed a vast estate. Her value to her family extended far beyond just bearing children. She was responsible for overseeing a complex household economy, which could include supervising agricultural production, managing servants, organizing supplies, and perhaps even engaging in trade. She would have directed the production of textiles, food preservation, and the general upkeep of the household, which was often a significant economic unit. Her administrative skills, her ability to manage resources, and her capacity to lead a large domestic enterprise were crucial for the family's prosperity and survival. Accounts from household manuals, though often later, reflect practices of such management. For example, a Frankish noblewoman's ability to manage a household efficiently directly contributed to her husband's wealth and reputation. These responsibilities required significant intelligence, organizational talent, and practical knowledge, attributes highly valued within their social circles. Piety was another profoundly valued quality in women. In a deeply Christian society, a woman's spiritual devotion, her acts of charity, and her commitment to religious practices were seen as immense virtues. Noblewomen often founded monasteries or endowed churches, acts that brought great spiritual merit and social prestige not only to themselves, but to their entire families. Abbesses, such as Liaba, an Anglo-Saxon nun who moved to Germany in the 8th century to assist St. Boniface in his missionary work, were highly respected for their spiritual wisdom, their learning, and their administrative abilities. Liaba served as an abbess at Tauberbischofsheim and was a confidante and advisor to Boniface. Her value lay not in her ability to bear children, but in her spiritual leadership, her erudition, and her administrative skills, which enabled the growth of the church in Francia. Her reputation was built on her intellect and piety, attracting many to her monastic schools. Social connections and diplomatic skills were also incredibly important, particularly for women in politically prominent families. Dynastic marriages were not just about producing heirs, they were about forging alliances between powerful families or kingdoms. The bride herself, through her family connections, her social graces, and her ability to integrate into a new court, was a vital diplomatic asset. She could serve as a conduit for communication, a symbol of alliance, and an influential figure in her new husband's court, often shaping political relationships. For instance, royal women were often key players in fostering cultural exchange and diplomatic ties between different regions, using their connections to broker peace or strengthen allegiances. Their value lay in their ability to bridge gaps between families and even nations, far beyond mere biological function. Even in peasant families, women's economic contributions went far beyond childbearing. They were essential labor in the fields, alongside men performing tasks like sowing, harvesting, and threshing. Within the home, they processed food, spun and wove textiles, made clothing, and cared for livestock. Their skills in crafts like brewing, baking, or dairying were vital to the family's sustenance and sometimes for producing goods for sale in local markets. Their capacity for hard physical work and their practical skills were invaluable to the survival and prosperity of the household. A woman who was a skilled weaver or a good manager of the family's small plot of land was highly valued for her direct contribution to the family's livelihood, irrespective of her number of children. Furthermore, some women were valued for their intellectual companionship and their role in preserving culture. While rare, there are accounts of literate women who participated in intellectual discussions or copied manuscripts. For example, some female monastic communities were centers of learning where women actively engaged with texts. The very act of transmitting knowledge and nurturing intellectual life was seen as a valuable contribution. A woman who could offer wise counsel, provide spiritual guidance, or contribute to the cultural life of a noble household or a religious community was valued for these qualities. Therefore, the idea that women in the early Middle Ages were valued only for childbearing is a significant oversimplification. While reproduction was certainly important, women were also highly esteemed for their administrative skills, their piety, their economic contributions, their social and diplomatic connections, and even their intellectual capacities. Their roles were diverse and their contributions multifaceted, proving that their worth in early medieval society extended far beyond the biological necessity of producing heirs. To understand the complexity of their lives, one must recognize the many ways their skills and attributes enriched their families and communities. Number 7. Women were completely subjected to male relatives. It is a common idea that women in the early Middle Ages were entirely under the thumb of their male relatives, always subject to the absolute authority of their fathers, brothers, and then their husbands, with no independent agency whatsoever. This perspective suggests that women had no voice or power within their families, and their lives were entirely dictated by the decisions of the men around them, without any possibility for influence or self-determination. The narrative often portrays women as passive figures, moved from one male guardianship to another throughout their lives, never truly exercising authority or contributing significantly to family decisions. This idea implies that the patriarchal structure of the time left women with no room for personal autonomy or any form of meaningful family leadership, making them mere extensions of the male line. However, while early medieval society was indeed patriarchal and male authority was legally enshrined, it is not accurate to say that women were completely subjected or entirely devoid of influence within their family structures. Women, particularly as mothers, wives, and widows, often wielded significant informal authority and could exert considerable influence, sometimes even acting as regents for their minor sons or managing substantial properties independently. Consider the role of a mother, particularly a queen mother or a noble matriarch. A mother's influence over her adult sons, even powerful kings or nobles, could be immense. This Queen Clotilde, wife of Clovis I, the founder of the Frankish kingdom, famously influenced her husband's conversion to Christianity and later guided her sons. Her spiritual and moral authority as a mother carried considerable weight even in the political sphere. Similarly, Queen Brunhild, after the death of her husband and sons, acted as regent for her grandsons, effectively ruling large parts of Francia for decades. Her authority stemmed from her position as grandmother and protector of the legitimate line, allowing her to command armies, issue laws, and negotiate with powerful figures. These queen mothers often served as critical advisors, political mentors, and powerful figures in their own right, shaping dynastic policies and ensuring the continuity of their lineage. Their maternal status provided a legitimate basis for their exercise of power, especially when their sons were young or weak. As wives, women often played crucial roles in managing the household, which was frequently the primary economic unit of the family. A noblewoman might oversee a large staff of servants, manage the household accounts, supervise agricultural production on the demesne, and ensure the smooth running of what was essentially a small enterprise. Her husband might be away on campaign or at court, leaving her in charge of the day-to-day operations and decision-making for the estate. Her practical competence and administrative skills were vital to the family's prosperity. For example, charters from the period sometimes show wives consenting to their husband's land grants, or even making joint decisions on property matters, suggesting a partnership in economic affairs. While the husband might have been the legal head, the wife's practical authority in the household was often extensive and respected. Widows, especially those with property and mature sons, often held a unique position of considerable independence. Upon the death of her husband, a widow might inherit a dower portion of the estate, or even hold guardianship of her minor children's inheritance. This meant she could manage significant wealth and property in her own name, making independent economic decisions, for example, regarding land sales or purchases. She could also arrange marriages for her children, a powerful social and political act. For instance, the wills and charters from Lombard Italy or Anglo-Saxon England frequently show widows acting as independent agents, donating land to monasteries, settling disputes, or otherwise disposing of their assets. They were no longer under the legal guardianship of a husband, and their status as a mother often gave them great respect and influence within the broader family network. They could choose to remarry or remain single, often retaining control over their deceased husband's property on behalf of their children. Furthermore, within extended family networks, women often played crucial roles in maintaining kinship ties, fostering alliances through marriage, and transmitting cultural values and religious piety. They were vital for the smooth functioning of society through their social roles, acting as mediators in disputes or as figures of authority within their own domestic spheres. The influence of an older female relative, such as an aunt or a sister, could also be significant, providing advice and support to younger family members. The network of female relations, often ignored in narratives focused solely on male power structures, could be a powerful force in shaping family decisions and maintaining social cohesion. So, while early medieval society was legally structured around male authority, the idea that women were completely subjected to male relatives and had no agency is an oversimplification. As mothers, wives, and especially as widows, women could and often did exercise considerable influence and informal authority within their families and even in broader society. Their contributions to household management, their roles in preserving lineage, their spiritual authority, and their ability to act as regents or independent property holders reveal a more complex picture than one of total female subjugation. To truly understand early medieval women, one must acknowledge the nuanced ways they navigated and often asserted their agency within patriarchal structures. Number 6. Women had no role in religion beyond being passive churchgoers. A pervasive belief about women in the early Middle Ages is that their involvement in religion was limited to being passive attendees at church services, simply listening to male clergy, and having no active or influential role in the spiritual life or institutional structure of the church. This idea suggests that women were excluded from theological discussions, leadership positions, and any meaningful participation beyond basic worship, effectively confining their religious expression to silent devotion. The common narrative implies that the church, being a male-dominated institution, offered no pathways for women to exercise authority, wisdom, or spiritual guidance, reducing them to mere recipients of religious doctrine without any agency in its development or dissemination. This view often overlooks the profound spiritual and administrative contributions women made to early medieval Christianity. However, historical records clearly demonstrate that women played incredibly active, influential, and diverse roles in early medieval religion, far exceeding mere passive attendance. They were founders, patrons, abbesses, mystics, and scholars, wielding significant spiritual and sometimes even temporal power within the ecclesiastical landscape. One of the most prominent ways women asserted their religious agency was through monasticism. Convents provided women with an alternative to marriage and a unique space for spiritual devotion, intellectual pursuits, and administrative leadership. Abbesses, the female heads of these monasteries, often held immense power and prestige. Take Abbess Hild of Whitby in 7th century Anglo-Saxon England. She governed a double monastery, meaning it housed both nuns and monks, exercising authority over both genders within her community. Hild was renowned for her wisdom and piety, and her monastery became a center of learning, attracting scholars and producing several bishops. But kings and prominent churchmen frequently sought her counsel. The Synod of Whitby, a pivotal moment in the history of the English Church, was held at her abbey. Hild was not just a passive worshiper, she was a powerful spiritual leader, an educator, and an influential figure in the political and religious life of her kingdom. Her authority and influence were deeply intertwined with her religious role. Beyond abbesses, women also played crucial roles as patrons of churches and monasteries. Wealthy noblewomen often used their resources to found new religious institutions or to endow existing ones, thereby securing spiritual merit for themselves and their families, and also exerting influence over the religious landscape. For instance, Queen Radegund, after leaving her royal husband, founded the monastery of Sainte Croix in Poitiers in the 6th century. She attracted many nuns, amassed a significant library, and made her convent a vibrant spiritual and intellectual center. Her patronage was not passive. It involved active decision-making, fundraising, and the shaping of a religious community. The dedication of their wealth and efforts highlights a deep commitment to religious life and a desire to actively shape its institutions. Women also engaged in profound personal piety and mysticism. Accounts of female saints and hermits show women choosing lives of intense spiritual devotion, often influencing others through their ascetic practices and spiritual insights. The Vitae Patrum, a collection of lives of early Christian hermits, includes stories of female ascetics who lived lives of profound spiritual discipline, demonstrating their commitment to religious ideals. These women, through their reputation for holiness, could attract followers, offer spiritual counsel, and inspire their communities, even if they held no formal church office. Their personal spiritual journeys were seen as powerful examples to the faithful, demonstrating an active and often radical engagement with their beliefs. Furthermore, some women were scholars and scribes within monastic communities. While perhaps less common than male scribes, female literacy was fostered in convents, allowing women to read, copy, and sometimes even compose religious texts. The existence of manuscripts copied by nuns and the intellectual pursuits fostered within certain female monastic centers demonstrate that women were not simply consumers of religious doctrine, but also active participants in its creation, preservation, and dissemination. The scholarly pursuits of women like Rotsvit of Gandersheim, though slightly later, her context is built on earlier foundations, speak to a tradition of female intellectual engagement within monastic settings. The very concept of sainthood involved active participation. Female saints were revered, their lives recorded in hagiographies, and their relics venerated. Pilgrimages were made to their shrines, and their intercession was sought. These women, through their exemplary lives and posthumous cults, continued to exert a powerful religious influence long after their deaths. Their stories were woven into the fabric of Christian belief, demonstrating that their spiritual agency was recognized and celebrated by wider society. So, the idea that women in the early Middle Ages were merely passive churchgoers is a gross simplification. From powerful abbesses managing vast spiritual and temporal enterprises, to pious noblewomen founding monasteries and individual women embracing lives of intense spiritual devotion, women actively shaped the religious landscape of their time. Their contributions were administrative, intellectual, spiritual, and financial, proving that their roles in early medieval religion were diverse, influential, and far from passive. To truly understand the religious life of the period, one must acknowledge the vibrant and varied participation of women. Number 5. Marriage was solely about male dominance and female submission. It is often portrayed that marriage in the early Middle Ages was a straightforward affair of absolute male dominance and unquestioning female submission, with the wife having no status, voice, or agency within the marital union. This perspective suggests that women entered marriage as mere property, with their primary role being to obey their husbands without question, produce children, and manage a household under strict male authority. The narrative implies that there was no room for partnership, mutual affection, or any form of influence from the wife, reducing the marital bond to a purely hierarchical relationship devoid of any reciprocal respect or shared decision-making. This view often focuses on legal provisions that placed wives under the legal guardianship of their husbands, suggesting a complete imbalance of power that left women powerless within their marriages. However, a closer examination of historical evidence reveals a far more complex reality. While patriarchal structures were indeed foundational to early medieval marriage, the relationship between husband and wife was not always one of simple, absolute dominance and submission. Those marriages were complex social, economic, and often emotional partnerships, with women frequently holding significant influence, contributing economically, and sometimes even inspiring deep affection and mutual respect. One key aspect often overlooked is the economic partnership inherent in many marriages. Women frequently brought a dowry in some regions or a morning gift, morgengabe, in Germanic traditions into the marriage. The dowry was a significant transfer of property or wealth from the bride's family to the groom or the couple, often intended for the wife's maintenance or as her share of the family inheritance. The morning gift was a gift from the husband to his wife on the morning after their wedding, symbolizing respect and often serving as her personal property. These endowments meant that women often controlled significant assets within the marriage, giving them a vested economic interest and a degree of leverage. They were not entering empty-handed. Their economic contributions were recognized and, especially for noblewomen, could be substantial, affecting the household's prosperity and status. These resources could provide a woman with security, especially in widowhood, and influence her standing within the marital unit. Furthermore, wives often played an indispensable role in managing the household economy, particularly in aristocratic families. While the husband might be engaged in warfare, politics, or hunting, the wife was often responsible for the day-to-day running of the estate, managing servants, overseeing agricultural production, and organizing crafts like brewing and weaving. This was not a subservient role, but a position of considerable responsibility and economic importance. For example, a Frankish noblewoman might be tasked with the management of a vast household, overseeing numerous dependents and substantial resources. Her administrative competence directly contributed to the family's wealth and prestige. This practical authority within the domestic sphere often translated into influence over wider family decisions, as her expertise was crucial for the household's functioning. While mutual affection might not have been the primary basis for arranged marriages, it was not entirely absent. Personal letters, grave inscriptions, and even some narrative accounts suggest that genuine love and partnership could develop within these unions. For example, some grave epitaphs for married couples speak of their mutual love and shared life. While not universal, these glimpses challenge the idea that all marriages were purely transactional or devoid of emotional connection. The Benedictine rule, for instance, emphasizes mutual respect and love within the monastic community, and while not directly about marriage, it reflects broader Christian ideals that could influence interpersonal relationships. Christian theology often emphasized the idea of marriage as a spiritual union, not just a physical one, which could foster a sense of shared purpose and respect. Moreover, women could exert significant influence within the family through their roles as mothers, advisors, and social connectors. A wife often acted as a confidante and advisor to her husband, particularly on family matters, the upbringing of children, and even political decisions. Queen Autofleda, wife of Theodoric the Great, is known to have influenced her husband's policies through her connections and counsel. Her advice, based on her lineage and her understanding of social dynamics, could be highly valued. She also played a crucial role in managing the royal household and maintaining social alliances. Her role in raising children, especially sons, was also a source of authority and influence, shaping the next generation. A wife's social connections, especially if she came from a powerful family, could also benefit her husband's standing and influence. Even legally, while women were under male guardianship, this did not always equate to absolute powerlessness. Legal codes sometimes protected women from abandonment or abuse, outlining penalties for husbands who mistreated their wives. While direct divorce was rare in many Christianized areas, legal separations were sometimes possible, often through ecclesiastical courts, indicating some recourse for wives in extreme situations. The emphasis on the sacred nature of marriage in Christian thought also provided a framework that, while patriarchal, could also impose duties and responsibilities on husbands. Therefore, the idea that marriage in the early Middle Ages was solely about male dominance and female submission oversimplifies a complex institution. While patriarchal norms were strong, women brought economic assets, exercised significant administrative authority within the household, could develop relationships of mutual affection and respect, and wielded considerable informal influence as wives, mothers, and social connectors. Marriages were multifaceted partnerships where women's contributions and agency, while constrained, were far from non-existent. To understand early medieval marriage, one must look beyond simplistic narratives and acknowledge the nuanced ways women navigated and shaped their marital lives. Number 4. Women were confined to the home. It is a common idea that women in the early Middle Ages were strictly confined to the domestic sphere, rarely venturing outside their homes and certainly not participating in public life, trade, or labor outside the household. This perspective often suggests that a woman's entire existence revolved around managing a household, raising children, and performing domestic chores, with no engagement in the broader economic, social, or political world. The narrative implies that women were essentially prisoners within their own walls, separated from the public sphere, which was considered exclusively male. This idea often paints a picture of women living isolated lives, completely detached from the hustle and bustle of medieval society, their contributions limited solely to the private domain. However, this idea is largely inaccurate and ignores the vast majority of women's lives in the early Middle Ages. While aristocratic women might have spent more time within their estates, the reality for most women, especially those from lower social strata, was one of active participation in a wide range of activities outside the home, often involving considerable physical labor, trade, and travel. Their contributions were vital to the functioning of their communities and economies. For the vast majority of the population, who were peasants, women worked alongside men in the fields. Agricultural labor was a collective effort, and women were indispensable to it. They participated in sowing, harvesting, weeding, gleaning, and tending to livestock. A typical peasant woman's day would have involved arduous physical work outside her dwelling, whether in her own small plot of land or on the lord's demesne. And records from manorial accounts and charters frequently show female laborers participating in fieldwork, contributing directly to the sustenance of their families and the productivity of the land. This work was not just supplemental, it was fundamental to survival. They were not confined to the hearth, they were out in sun and rain, toiling in the fields to ensure food security for their households. And beyond agriculture, women were actively involved in various crafts and trades. Many women were skilled textile producers, spinning wool into yarn and weaving cloth, often for sale or exchange. This work was often done within the home, but also involved trips to markets to sell goods or acquire raw materials. Women also brewed ale, baked bread, and processed dairy products, often producing surpluses that could be sold in local markets. Archaeological finds, such as spindle whorls and weaving combs, are frequently found in female burials, indicating the widespread nature of these economic activities. In towns, women were often market vendors selling produce, textiles, or prepared foods. Historical records, such as guild regulations from slightly later periods, often show female participation, suggesting that the foundations for such roles were present in the earlier medieval centuries. They were active participants in local economies, contributing directly to their family's income and the broader flow of goods. Travel was also a part of many women's lives, not just for the elite. Peasant women would travel to local markets, to the mill, or to neighboring villages for social or religious gatherings. Women, especially those from noble or royal families, traveled for political reasons such as diplomatic missions, arranged marriages, or to visit estates. For instance, Queen Emma of Normandy, a powerful Anglo-Saxon and Danish queen in the 11th century, traveled extensively between England and the continent for political and familial reasons. Even common women undertook pilgrimages to local shrines or even more distant holy sites, demonstrating a willingness and ability to travel far from their homes for spiritual reasons. These journeys, often arduous, show that women were not geographically static but engaged with the wider world. Even aristocratic women, while spending much time within their estates, were not entirely confined. They managed vast households, which were often large economic units, overseeing servants, tenants, and the complex logistics of daily life. This required significant interaction with people outside the immediate family, including administrators, merchants, and religious figures. They hosted guests, held court, and participated in social and political gatherings, often acting as important figures in their husbands' or family's public image. For example, royal women often had their own households and played important roles in receiving foreign envoys and maintaining diplomatic ties, activities that were inherently public. Their domestic domain was often a nexus of public and private life, demanding a visible and active presence. So, the idea that women in the early Middle Ages were universally confined to the home is a misunderstanding rooted in a narrow view of medieval society. The vast majority of women, particularly those of lower social classes, worked extensively outside the home in agricultural labor and various trades. Their women from all strata traveled for economic, social, political, and religious reasons. Their contributions to the economy, their active participation in markets, and their physical presence in the public sphere were undeniable. To truly understand the lives of early medieval women, one must acknowledge their active, varied, and often public roles in society. Number 3. Women were illiterate and uneducated. A widespread belief about women in the early Middle Ages is that they were almost entirely illiterate and received no formal education, especially outside of a very narrow aristocratic elite. This perspective often suggests that women were deliberately kept ignorant, denied access to books or writing materials, and therefore could not engage in intellectual pursuits or contribute to learned culture. The common narrative implies that literacy and education were exclusively male domains, with women being limited to practical skills like domestic management or textile production, completely cut off from the world of text and scholarly knowledge. This idea paints a picture of women as unlettered figures, unable to read or write, and thus excluded from the intellectual currents of their time. However, historical evidence challenges this sweeping generalization. While it is true that overall literacy rates were lower in the early Middle Ages than in some other periods, and certainly lower for women than for men, it is not accurate to say that women were universally illiterate or uneducated. Many women, particularly within monastic communities and aristocratic households, received significant education, could read and write, and actively participated in intellectual and literary culture. Convents were vital centers of female education. For women who chose a religious life, monasteries offered opportunities for learning that were often unavailable in secular society. Nuns were taught to read the Bible, liturgical texts, and sometimes even classical authors. They learned Latin, the language of scholarship and the church, and were often involved in copying manuscripts, a highly skilled and intellectual task. For instance, archaeological finds from early medieval convents often include writing implements, suggesting that literacy was practiced. Abbesses, such as Lioba of Bischofsheim in the 8th century, were renowned for their learning and actively fostered education within their communities, accumulating libraries and teaching their nuns. These women were not just reading, they were engaging with complex theological and philosophical ideas, proving that convents were hubs of female scholarship and intellectual activity. Within aristocratic families, many daughters received a basic education, often at home from tutors or within convents, to prepare them for managing large households, participating in courtly life, or engaging in religious patronage. They needed to be able to read religious texts, manage accounts, and write letters. Queen Bathold, a 7th century Frankish queen, despite her humble origins, was known for her piety and intellectual interests, supporting monasteries and promoting learning. Even if they did not engage in formal scholarly writing, their literacy was essential for their roles. Duoda's Liber Manualis, written in the 9th century for her son, is a powerful example of a lay noblewoman who was highly educated, fluent in Latin, and capable of profound theological and moral reflection. Her work demonstrates a sophisticated level of literacy and intellectual engagement, proving that such education was possible and valued for noblewomen outside the cloister. The evidence of women's literacy also appears in charters and legal documents. While some women might have made a simple mark, many noble and even some non-noble women signed their names on these documents, indicating their ability to write. The ability to read and understand legal texts was crucial for women who managed property or engaged in legal disputes, which many women did. Charters from places like the Abbey of St. Gall show numerous female signatories demonstrating practical literacy in a legal context. Furthermore, women were often patrons of books and art. While they might not have physically copied manuscripts themselves, their commissioning of books, sometimes beautifully illuminated, speaks to their intellectual interests and their desire to engage with written culture. They actively supported the creation and preservation of texts, influencing the transmission of knowledge. The presence of richly bound books and precious reliquaries in the burials of some aristocratic women suggests a personal connection to religious and learned objects. The idea that women were systematically kept illiterate is also challenged by the Christian emphasis on personal piety and reading of religious texts. While formal schooling was not widespread for commoners, the church encouraged basic literacy for all who could achieve it so they could engage with scripture and prayers. While this might not have led to widespread sophisticated literacy, it indicates an encouragement of reading for spiritual purposes that extended to women. So, the idea that women in the early Middle Ages were universally illiterate and uneducated is a significant oversimplification. While opportunities were not equal to men's and varied greatly by social class and region, many women within monastic communities and aristocratic households received substantial education, became literate, and actively participated in intellectual and religious culture. Convents served as crucial centers of female learning, and noblewomen often demonstrated high levels of literacy and intellectual engagement. To truly understand the lives of early medieval women, one must acknowledge the diverse educational opportunities that existed for them and their contributions to the learned culture of the time. Number 2, women had no legal rights. A very common notion about women in the early Middle Ages is that they had absolutely no legal rights, were entirely without protection under the law, and were treated as mere property or appendages of men. This perspective often suggests that women could not own property, inherit wealth, represent themselves in court, or make any legal decisions independently. It paints a picture where women were completely disenfranchised by the legal systems of the time, subject to the arbitrary will of their male relatives and possessing no legal standing of their own. The argument often put forward is that the patriarchal nature of early medieval law codes meant that women were systematically excluded from legal agency, leaving them vulnerable and powerless in all legal matters. However, a close examination of the diverse legal codes and practices of the early Middle Ages reveals a much more complex and nuanced reality. While it is true that women's legal status was often defined in relation to male guardians, and certain aspects of law were discriminatory, women certainly possessed and exercised a range of legal rights, including property ownership, inheritance, and the ability to participate in legal proceedings. Their legal standing varied significantly depending on their social class, marital status, and the specific regional law code they lived under. Women often had significant property rights. In many Germanic law codes, such as the Lex Salica Frankish law or the Lex Burgundionum Burgundian law, women could inherit property, though sometimes with restrictions, especially regarding land. For example, while the Lex Salica famously excluded women from inheriting Salic land, often interpreted as ancestral military land, it did not prevent them from inheriting other forms of property, like movable goods, livestock, or even non-Salic land. This meant that women, even under this specific code, could own considerable wealth. More broadly, women frequently appeared in charters as landowners, donors, and recipients of land. They could sell, buy, and grant property, often with the consent of a male guardian, but sometimes independently, particularly if they were widows. The large number of women named in property records from the Carolingian period, for instance, demonstrates their active participation in the land economy. Inheritance laws varied, but many allowed daughters to inherit in the absence of sons, or to inherit alongside brothers, albeit sometimes with a smaller share. For example, in Anglo-Saxon England, women could inherit land and other property from their parents and husbands. The wills from this period frequently show women inheriting significant estates and then having the right to dispose of these properties themselves, often through further bequests to family members or religious institutions. A prominent example is Winflade, an Anglo-Saxon noblewoman whose 10th century will details her extensive landholdings, slaves, and precious goods, which she meticulously bequeathed to her heirs and the church, showcasing her absolute control over her property. Women also had legal protections and recourse in specific situations. Early medieval law codes outlined penalties for crimes against women, such as abduction, assault, and rape. While the penalties often involved fines paid to her family or husband reflecting a property-based view of certain harms, the fact that these acts were legally punishable indicates a recognition of women's rights to bodily integrity and protection. Women could also appear in court, either directly or through a male representative, a munbor or fideasaur, to pursue legal claims, such as those related to property disputes, marriage contracts, or inheritance. The records of legal proceedings occasionally show women actively defending their rights and presenting their cases. The legal status of a widow was often particularly strong. Upon the death of her husband, a widow typically regained full legal independence and control over her dower portion and any personal property she brought into the marriage. She was no longer under the legal guardianship of the husband and could manage her affairs, including her children's inheritance, with considerable autonomy. Many powerful women in the early Middle Ages, like Queen Theodolinda of the Lombards or Queen Emma of Normandy, exercised their greatest political and economic power as widows or queen mothers, illustrating the significant legal agency afforded to them in this status. They could make wills, conduct business, and act as legal guardians for their minor children. Furthermore, women who entered monastic life also gained a distinct legal status. As nuns, they were often independent of their secular families and subject to ecclesiastical law. Abbesses, in particular, held significant legal authority over their monastic communities and their extensive lands. They could represent their abbeys in secular courts, negotiate with kings and nobles, and make significant legal and administrative decisions, demonstrating a profound level of legal agency that surpassed many men. So, the idea that women in the early Middle Ages had no legal rights is a fundamental misconception. While early medieval legal systems were patriarchal, women possessed rights regarding property ownership, inheritance, and protection against certain crimes. Their legal standing varied, with widows and abbesses often enjoying significant autonomy. Women actively participated in legal and economic transactions, challenging the simplistic narrative of complete legal disenfranchisement. To truly understand women's lives in this period, one must acknowledge the nuanced and often surprisingly robust legal positions many women held within the diverse legal frameworks of the early Middle Ages. Number 1. Women were universally oppressed and powerless. It is perhaps the most pervasive and misleading idea about women in the early Middle Ages, the notion that they were universally oppressed, completely powerless, and had no agency or influence whatsoever in society. This perspective suggests that women were nothing more than silent, subservient figures, entirely controlled by men, relegated to the background, and unable to make any significant contributions to politics, economics, or culture. This overarching narrative often casts women as victims of an inherently misogynistic society, without any avenues for self-determination or leadership. The argument often paints a bleak picture of women as passive recipients of their fate, their lives defined by a complete lack of power or control, fundamentally shaping our modern understanding of the era. However, historical evidence consistently demonstrates that this generalized idea is a vast oversimplification and often completely inaccurate. While societal norms were patriarchal and women certainly faced limitations, countless examples show women actively exercising power, wielding influence, holding authority, and playing vital roles across all aspects of early medieval life. Their agency was often expressed in diverse ways, challenging any notion of universal powerlessness. Consider the role of queens. Royal women in the early Middle Ages were far from mere consorts. They were often powerful political figures, managing royal households, acting as regents for minor sons, influencing policy, and even leading armies. Queen Brunhild, a Frankish queen in the 6th and 7th centuries, ruled for decades as regent for her grandsons, issuing laws, making treaties, and engaging in fierce political struggles against rival factions. She commanded immense wealth and exercised significant authority, demonstrating a profound level of political power. Similarly, Queen Emma of Normandy in the 10th and 11th centuries was queen to 2 English kings, Aethelred the Unready and Cnut the Great, and played a crucial role in political succession and diplomacy, securing her position as a formidable power broker in Anglo-Saxon and Danish England. These women were not powerless. They were central figures in the political landscape of their time, shaping the destinies of kingdoms. Beyond queens, women in religious life, particularly abbesses, held immense spiritual, economic, and often political power. And abbesses like Hild of Whitby in 7th century Anglo-Saxon England or Gertrude of Nivelles in 7th century Francia oversaw vast estates, managed large communities of monks and nuns, and served as advisors to kings and bishops. Their monasteries were centers of learning, art, and political influence. Hild's Abbey hosted a pivotal church council, and Gertrude's community was a hub of intellectual and spiritual exchange. These women were not passive, they were powerful administrators, spiritual leaders, and intellectual patrons who commanded respect and wielded significant institutional authority. Their decisions impacted many lives and shaped religious and cultural developments. Even lay noblewomen, though perhaps not ruling kingdoms, held considerable influence within their own spheres. They managed vast households, which were often significant economic units, overseeing numerous servants and extensive resources. They were responsible for the daily operations of estates, managing agricultural production, textile manufacturing, and food processing. Their administrative skills were crucial for the family's prosperity. Many noblewomen owned property, sometimes inheriting land and wealth, and could dispose of it through wills or donations. For instance, the Will of Winflade, a 10th century Anglo-Saxon noblewoman, shows her meticulous control over a large estate, including land, slaves, and valuable goods, demonstrating her economic power and legal agency. These women were active participants in the economy, making substantial contributions to their family's wealth and status. For common women, their power might not have been political or institutional, but it was vital to the functioning of society. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields, participating in essential agricultural labor, and were involved in various crafts and trades like textile production, brewing, and market vending. Their economic contributions were indispensable for their family's survival and the local economy. While their lives were often hard, they were not powerless. Their labor and skills were crucial and highly valued, demonstrating their agency in the daily survival and prosperity of their communities. They managed households, raised children, and maintained social networks, all contributing to the resilience of their societies. And furthermore, women exercised influence through their roles as mothers and wives, often acting as confidantes, advisors, and educators within their families. Their advice could shape their husbands' decisions, and their efforts in raising children molded the next generation. The respect and moral authority accorded to mothers could be immense, allowing them to exert significant informal power. Through marriage alliances, noblewomen also served as crucial links between powerful families, contributing to diplomacy and maintaining social cohesion. So, the idea that women in the early Middle Ages were universally oppressed and powerless is a gross misrepresentation. While patriarchal structures existed, women found and created various avenues for power, influence, and agency. From powerful queens and abbesses to economically vital noblewomen and laboring peasant women, their contributions to political life, religious institutions, economic activities, and family dynamics were undeniable. To truly understand the early Middle Ages, one must move beyond simplistic narratives and recognize the diverse and active roles women played in shaping their world, proving that their lives were far from universally powerless or without agency.